Regulate, stop. Let's ask the question, maybe the way we organize production. And what do I mean? The activity that most of us spend most of our lives doing. 7 days a week, Monday to Friday, you go to work. You get up in the morning, you get ready, you go to work. And you work until 5 o'clock, and then you come home. You figure out, you count the hours, you spend an enormous part of your life in the workplace, living under the rules of the workplace. By what logic is that sacrosanct? Why does the mass of people produce value, surplus, profit, that is received and disposed of by 15 to 20 people who are responsible to shareholders that have absolutely nothing to do with the company or its life? What is that? How did that become sacrosanct? Think of it this way, if the economics doesn't grab you. Let me try it with that holy of holies for American audiences, democracy. The idea that one ought to be part of an institution in which the decisions that affect your life are something you have the right to participate in. Okay, 30,000 people work in a factory. They are in an institution 5 days a week. They focus their whole lives on it. What are their participations in the decisions that shape the industrial life? Zilch. They're not shareholders, they're not on the board, they go to work and then they go home. They live with the consequences, new technology, move it abroad, whatever, but they have no participation. It's a bizarre society that embraces democracy, but only about where you live, not where you work. That's strange. You might even have an argument that says if you don't have it where you work, it'll never be real where you live either, because its absence where you work will undo its presence where you live. As in, the corporation that can get into the hands of the top 15 people all the profits will be able to buy the politicians you believe you democratically elect in the community. Why is that sacrosanct? Here's an alternative. Suppose corporations were now to be changed in the way they operate. Basic idea. The people in the corporation become their own board of directors. Monday through Thursday you work, whatever it is you make. Cameras, candles, software programs, hot dogs. Friday you come to work and you don't do that. Friday you come to work and you sit in meetings all day. And you make the decisions on how to utilize the profits of this enterprise in which you work. Everybody's job description becomes not only making something, but serving on the board of directors of the something that's being made. It's just part of your work. You aren't a drone anymore. You have to participate in designing and controlling and directing and imagining. Just imagine what an interesting life we'd all have if we had to do that kind of work as well. But here's very concrete examples. It goes back to the beginning of my talk. In the 1970s, a moment was possible when boards of directors could stop raising wages. Suppose workers were their own board of directors. Guess what? They wouldn't have stopped raising wages. That would have meant there was no need to borrow money. They wouldn't have done that. It's unlikely a board of directors run by workers would be busy outsourcing jobs either. And it's also unlikely that a board of directors of workers would be busy bribing politicians, since they live in the same community that has to, it's not a tiny group of people making a decision, reporting to a board of directors. It's the workers themselves that have to live with the results of polluted air, which they would have an interest not to do, and so on. We would have a very different set of conditions. If the mass of people were participating in running our industries, the chances of them doing what a government wants to be done for the interests of the society as a whole would be one hell of a lot better than having a small corporation run by a handful of board of directors. Would there still be conflict and struggle? Of course. but the society would work very differently, have different values, have different kinds of struggles. It's a different way to understand the problem. And I don't think we would have had the crisis we have now. And the very fact that that might be the case is all the argument I need to make that there is no reason for it to be out of the public discussion. And for those of you that think, and I know there are some of you, that this is somehow too far, too much, pie in the sky, and so on, let me review. We've come a long way in the last 6 months. Things that were unthinkable here a year ago are now regularly in the newspaper. President Bush had to make a statement 2 months ago in which he defended capitalism. I thought that was stunning. He defended, given his popularity, one could presume that if 80% of the people don't like something else he's doing, they might not like that one either. It's a remarkable change. And as these other quote-unquote solutions prove to be largely ineffective, supplanted by bigger versions of the same thing, we might all surprise ourselves by how soon there will be a demand for something else that might work. And it would be a real shame if the American left had nothing to offer. No real alternative. Is all the left going to do is say, oh, Mr. Obama was bigger what you did, needs to be bigger still. We don't need a left for that. Mr. Krugman will do that. And I think it's important that we take that seriously. And if you're worried that the American people aren't ready, I don't think that's fair, and I think that's an insult, and I don't think they deserve it either. I'll conclude with a story. I used to teach often very large courses at the University of Massachusetts, 300, 400 students in them. And I often handed out at the beginning of the semester a little piece of paper to all the students asking them, write down what you most hope will be your economic situation a few years after you graduate. And the students liked that. They filled out the little piece of paper, and I would gather them and have my teaching assistant tabulate the results. The overwhelmingly preferred condition was the following: be my own boss. I want to be my own boss. And I used to say to them, Jesus, sort of sad that you want that, since the odds of your getting to be in that position are really poor. You are, in fact, going to go be in a place working where you have a boss. And then I realized that wasn't a smart answer. I shouldn't do that. Much better was to say, here, I got this idea. If the workers collectively took over the enterprises of America, that's a practical way you could realize. That's within your grasp. And it might make a big difference both to the way the economy works and to the way that your own life gets spread out. If it is true, as many people say, that for the 21st century, Marxism and socialism have to come up with a new way to conceptualize the project, an alternative to capitalism that is concrete and real and immediate and speaks to the problems of our society in a way that will not be confused with liberals or Keynesians or any of that, that represent a real fundamental change from the bottom in the place where everybody works, then this might be the best way to move that project forward. Not to discuss it, to stay in the realm of the tired old debates, a little more government intervention, a little less government, is to consign ourselves to the worst possible situation, that this crisis creates an opportunity for the left we have not seen for decades. And the crisis would be if we don't come up with some imaginative, alternative ways to respond that may be a little bit new and difficult for people, but if we get them, we'll give them a sense of a project and a mission and a possibility to change their own lives as well as the economy that seems to me better than most of the alternatives the left at this point offers. So So thank you very much. Let's stop, and if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to.
Is an independent business owner. He tried to involve his workers in a non-hierarchical organization, a bit of a collective. They weren't the most skilled or most educated workers, but it was a blue-collar company. Had some artistic value in it, whatever. So it failed miserably, and he was well educated. He pretty much knew what he was doing, but I think cultural changes and a disposition mentally needs to be there to form these collectives. I mean, the unions can't remake themselves. What's going to happen before these worker collectives? What's going to be the prerequisite to that?
Well, my guess about the future is no better than anybody else's here. My guess is, though, that it will not happen because we come up with good arguments about why it ought to happen. Those are useful. That'll give people ideas. It's helpful to do. I'm doing it, right? So I think it's worth doing. But my guess is that the movement will come somewhere else. Typically what happens, in my reading of history, is that the conditions become unbearable and people then move to say, something has got to give. It's in that moment of the negation that the brain opens up to hear, okay, if I actually mean it, I don't want to do that anymore. What else? And in that moment, there has to be a left. See, America has the same moments other countries do like that, which are actually fairly often. What we have not had, what makes us so different, for example, from a place like France, which is in other ways quite similar to us. But in France, in every newsstand, in every town, in every village, the communists have a newspaper and the socialists have a daily paper. And it's just the minute something happens, you get their perspective on it. It's part of the thought. If you have a crisis in your village, in your town, in your factory, there's immediately a left. So my feeling is we have to be out there talking about it so that as crises arise that make things unbearable as they are, as human beings struggle for an alternative, we may get some ears to talk to. Let me give you a concrete example I hope most of you know. A few days ago, in an obscure little factory in Chicago, right? A typical employer did what employers do. It's either true or not, I don't know. No one has really figured it out yet. The story is, there's a small company, it has a few employees, makes windows or something like that, on credit from, like these businesses always do, borrowing from the Bank of America. And the Bank of America will not renew the credit, and so they're going out of business. They are required by law to give 60 days notice to the workers that they will be closing their factory, and they had other obligations they had, which they ignored or refused to honor. And so a moment came this week when these workers were going to be bounced out of there in the normal way that happens everywhere in America all the time. But something is different. Something is in the air somewhere. Now, granted, the union that's involved there is a union with a long leftist history. For those of you who know the history of the United Electrical Workers and their struggle in the 50s and the split away of the International Union of Electrical Workers and so forth. Yes, but that's the story. It's not just that there was a young left-oriented woman who was there, the business agent or whatever it is, she was there. Sure, that played a role, but there's something going on in the larger society. So this group of workers, instead of slinking off to look for other jobs, being defeated, which is the normal reaction, or maybe even going to the union and issuing a grievance that would take, a year and a half to get resolved through the courts, by which time everybody would have had to scatter to get a job or survive. Instead of that, they did like the workers in Argentina when they had their collapse a few years ago. They took over. They're sitting in the tradition of the 1930s in Flint and places like that. The workers are in there, and the same stories are happening. Community people are coming with turkeys and food. Jesse Jackson went on Sunday, forcing Obama to make a statement yesterday that is at least supportive of the workers in a general way, which he did, and he deserves credit for it. It's already a sign of something different. But the most interesting thing, I think, is that in a moment of crisis for a largely, if I understand correctly, Hispanic workforce, these folks made an unusual, for America, a very unusual decision. We're not disappearing, we're not going away, we're going to take over the factory, which they did, not let other people in. I don't believe they're running the production, they're just sort of sitting there, keeping it clean and so on. But that's what I'm talking about. Those crises are proliferating across the American landscape now. All over the United States, similar situations are happening. And the question is, and I'm even struck, as I think some of you are, by the amount of publicity this is generating. Despite themselves, the media had to kind of have film clips of it, and spread it out pretty much. At times had to carry stories about it. That's also a sign. That's very interesting that it isn't swept away the way these kinds of things, or ignored altogether, they are. That is the trick. For us to come up with an idea that this isn't, by the way, just a stopgap measure. Of course, it's the next step. Is this just to get the 60-day notice, or just to get this? Or is this maybe, a la Argentina, maybe we can run? Maybe this is a permanent alternative, not a temporary one. Maybe we shouldn't sit in just to get what we're owed in money or whatever it is, but maybe this can be a longer-term job for us. Who needs the employer? For example, because this is easy, suppose the government's program to stimulate the economy took the following form. Suppose Mr. Obama could be reached on the following. Don't just have a infrastructure program where you buy equipment from John Deere and then hire another company to rebuild the bridge. Here's a thought. Provide low-cost loan or interest-free loan to groups of working people who want to get together and operate collectively run businesses on the premise that we in America like freedom of choice. It's very important for us to be able to have 11 kinds of toothpaste. So we can go in there and pick the one with pink dots instead of the one with blue dots, right? The freedom of choice. Okay, let's give Americans a freedom of choice. You either work in a factory with a board of directors telling you what to do, or you work in this other place. Let's choose. Let's see what Americans want. Let's see what the quality of the product is that comes out of one kind of organized enterprise and another. Let's Americans choose between a socialist organization of production and no prejudging, free choice. This country wouldn't dare. And why might that be? But that would be put a lot of people to work. Give a lot of people a responsibility, give a lot of people training, and wonderful. Here's a way of solving some economic. If that was in the air, then maybe something like that would have to be done. It's really a question of us willing to think in a different way, even though it isn't new, friends. That's why I make the remarks. I know it's fashionable among my colleagues, academics, to keep the old labels at bay, particularly the label of the old man, Mr. Marx. I would have to be, however, an intellectually extremely dishonest person if I didn't own up to where some of these ideas come to. They come from Marx. They're about Marx. There, I said it. It's like George Carlin, you know. Let a bolt of lightning come down and get me if I said Marx. See? No lightning. Shoot.
You mentioned a couple of different models for how the economy might go. One, the Depression, where there was inflation and lowering prices and harder, and then a war got us out of 25% inflation. You mentioned our lives. We had the 70s where we had lowered prices, and then we had stagflation. How do you see the next 5 to 10 years here?
Well, it's a good question, very hard to answer. Let me put it this way. I'm sorry. It's a very good question, hard to answer. Right now, it's pretty clear we have the greatest risk is of deflation, of falling prices because of economies going into pretty nearly free fall. There's no demand. Production has been built up, the capacity to be built up. We had this boom for 25 years. Granted, it was artificial. Granted, it was debt-based, but it built up capacity. Try to think of it this way. There once was a world full of the capacity to produce 25 years ago, and to that you add China. Oh my goodness, that's a lot of excess capacity, a lot of capacity to produce beyond what is now purchasable. So the immediate, I think it's fair to say, the immediate prospect is for deflation, which hurts all kinds of people. You know, if you owe money a certain amount and prices go down, it becomes much more onerous to still have to pay the loan you took out of that money when prices are lower, etc. Here's the other side of the coin, however. Much of the solutions that I've talked about have involved the government effectively pumping vast new amounts of money into the economy, printing a lot of new money and pumping it in. When you ask people in the highest levels of the American government, aren't you nervous about all of that money sitting out there? Since these are the kind of people who used to say every third week how dangerous it is to do what they are now doing. The answer you get, which I find astonishing, is basically the following. The situation is now so bad that we cannot afford to worry what might happen later. We have to do it now, otherwise the later is academic, it's over. So we can't worry that the extra money, it's the same answer you get when you say, look, let's see, you're going to spend trillions of dollars on bailing out. You are looking at enormous deficits, difference in the government between what they can raise and what they're committed to spend. And so the government is going to have to borrow, and you're going to have a level of government debt that is enormous, that's going to have to be paid back, and interest has to be paid on that. And how is the government going to do that? And the answer to all these questions is not to dispute the reasonableness of the question, but simply to say that all has to wait. Because if we have to get through this, and if we don't, then none of that will matter anyway. So the answer is, we are setting up ourselves for a whole host of problems, of which inflation is clearly one possibility, but the attitude in the top levels of government, I believe that's true both for Mr. Obama and for the outgoing administration, they've decided this is the urgent, critical problem, much worse than anything we've had in a long, long time. A footnote about that. In my profession as economics, it's not just socialism that has been out of discourse for 25, 30 years in any serious way. It's really been 30 years of the celebration of capitalism. And it means that adults who have been economists they've been celebrating. They haven't been worrying about capitalism's flaws. They haven't been worried about capitalism's problems. They haven't been studying how to deal with those problems. They're just not very well equipped. This wasn't supposed to happen. Deregulation, private enterprise, free markets, all of that were supposed to provide us with a royal one-way ticket to prosperity and growth. Therefore, who should worry about the details of everything breaking down? Part of what you're seeing now is not just a serious crisis, but a serious incapacity of those in charge to cope. They don't even know, they're running around. You get really this sense on television, if you watch, of a helter-skelter, try this, try that, bullshit flying about whatever they're doing as they grasp on this possibility or that one. The bullshit, that's a technical term in economics. But I believe it's a reflection of a profession that is very seriously kind of out of touch with not just how to fix the problem, but it's also true, and Max and others have pointed this out to me, I hadn't understood it so well earlier, that over the last 30 years, the boom in profits sparked an explosion, not just in which the financial sector of the American economy got much larger relatively to what it had been before, but also proliferated new instruments, new connections, new agencies, new kinds of securities, and it's hard to keep up. There's a real lag in the ability of the profession to understand these mechanisms, let alone to understand how to cope when they break down. And you're seeing not just the breakdown of a system, but the consequences of having had this wild notion that this could never happen, would never happen, was nothing you had to worry about, that has hobbled the capacity of the, quote, experts to deal with it. Here, the idea here is we're going to offset the collapse of consumption, mass consumption, by having the government step in and do mass infrastructure. Instead of people buying shirts and furniture and chairs, the government is going to make roads. That's what the Europeans are proposing. The Chinese are trying to figure out a way to get the infrastructure. Everybody's talking about infrastructure. And if you think about it again, it's a wonderful evasion of everything I've said to you tonight. There's no change in the basic structure of our enterprises that's being talked about. We're just trying to shift from these goods to those goods. If the people are bankrupt and can't buy anything, okay, let the government start buying stuff and put people to work making bridges and roads and aquifers and that kind of stuff. And the question is, can that work? I don't know. I think there's very big ifs about it. The idea that this is a quickie solution, that is really nutty. First of all, it takes time. It takes a while to organize production to produce a hairbrush. You don't just overnight say, oh, no hairbrush, tractor. It doesn't go like that. It takes time. No, it takes time to train, goods move in a different place, you need different warehouses. That's and it takes time. We don't have that much time. This is going to take time. Even the Obama program takes time, number one. Number two, if you leave the corporations in there, then what the government is doing is going to buy things from a corporation. There we go back to square one again. Then we give money to the corporation. The difference between what we give them and what they pay their workers are the profits. Those are in the hands of the board of directors, and they have their own agenda. And that agenda is not necessarily, and nor is there anything you can do about that, the one that Mr. Obama has, let alone the one that the mass of the people have. So you're back again to this peculiar situation in which you want boards of directors to go with the program. And you don't want to face that they have a different program. And as long as you leave them in position with the resources, theirs is the program you're going to get, and the one that the government wants goes by the by. And that the pressure then builds up, and it seems to me it's a very open question whether you're going to get the kinds of changes to work here in the United States, for example, in terms of a significant impact on employment and so on, given the way this Obama program is, at least the little bit we know now, which is just sketchy, how it looks. Well, you know, I don't want to keep beating the same horse, but as long as a corporation is run the way it is, then you utilize automation, machinery, to get more from your workers, to save on the wage bill of your workers, to gather that in as profit, and then to use it for the growth and profitability of the corporation. You're really asking a different question. Take advantage of technology, so if fewer people are needed to work, well, then we can all have a couple hours more free time, and we can still get the same. That's a completely different mentality. That might be an argument you could make in an enterprise that was run by workers in a society like that, where the imperative to make more profits or die wasn't operative anymore. But then you're talking about a different arrangement. It was a colossal social struggle in which the mass of the trade union movement, the socialists, the communists, and so forth, banded together and had a long, difficult struggle over many years to implement that policy. And it was contested by the business community from day one, and the workers have had to take some defeats in recent years as some of those gains were taken back. Again, the argument, if you make a regulation like that, like in France, this 37-hour week or 35-hour week, or the rotation of unemployment, that unemployment has to be shared, you can't have some people employed and others unemployed, all those kinds of left-wing innovations, because they left in place the private corporations, they left in place the enemy who undid what they got. It's the same question again. When I use that statistic about the rising wages, I have to rely on the statistics that are available to us. And it probably comes as no great surprise that American labor statistics are not gathered according to Marxian criteria. That's not what they use. So it's very important. In Marxian theory, there's a distinction made, a very important distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor. Workers that produce a surplus and workers that create the conditions for that first group of workers to make a surplus. So those are distinguished for very important reasons. That doesn't operate in conventional statistics. They don't look at that. They don't categorize workers that way. So I have to rely on a general average. And like all general averages, it can hide all kinds of things when you do that kind of averaging. But nonetheless, I still think it's an extraordinary general phenomena to have the average of real wages of the American people rise over 150-year periods. I think I'm safe inferring from that the remarkable something that stopped in the 1970s, because it's really not so important whether it's right. It's more important whether this stopping in the 70s that I build my story around is valid. On the question of Obama, at this point, I think it's fair to say, he is proposing a fairly radical version of conventional Keynesian stimulus. He's going to pump up government spending. It's what liberal Democrats have always, in a sense, favored. It's larger than what he's proposing than before, but in the same magnitude as what Bush did was larger than what Republicans did before once the situation got worse. Is there a possibility that this might, together with enough other changes, if they all happen, get us out of this box? It's possible, sure it's possible. But I think we've been shown that the large versions of all these other policies didn't work. And put that together with the ability of corporations to frustrate by their own strategies of what to do with their surplus, even the best plans of the Obama administration, giving them the benefit of the doubt that they have good plans, makes me very dubious when I look at it. That this is going to be anything like the alternative. You know, I gave you an alternative. Suppose money were made available to set up these new sorts of enterprises with workers able to be their own boards of directors. I push that because I want, as I've told you, people to think in new and different ways about what socialism should mean to people and what might solve our problems. But I don't have to go that far. You know, a left-wing liberal could already complain about Obama's plan in the following way. Why no direct hiring by the government of people, which was done in the 1930s? When you couldn't get enough people to work, when the private sector boards of directors made the decision not to hire, leaving vast numbers of people without a job in the private sector, Roosevelt, at least on some occasions and in some ways, chose not to go buy things from private companies in the hope that they would then hire. He gave them that opportunity. They didn't do it, so he said, okay, the government will hire people directly. There's a whole lot of things that need to be done in the society, and the government will hire people and have them do it. If you've never had a chance to take a look at that, the best history is of the WPA, this extraordinary program in the 1930s, the likes of which we've never had before or since, in which I don't know the number, but tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of unemployed American artists. Singers, dancers, sculptors, painters, musicians, actors, writers, all were simply put on the government payroll, and then they sat around scratching their heads and saying, what are we going to do with these people? They can't do anything, they're artists, right? So, well, that was the mentality. So here's what we'll do, we'll set them up and move them around the country and bring to the American people in little towns and cities who could never afford a symphony or a theater group or an exhibit of modern art, they're now going to get art and culture, and we're going to make it a common property of the population, paying the artists to provide the culture, and the government picks up the bill. Extraordinary. I mean, let your mind go at what could be done, but it requires that next step, the taboo. Instead of private employment, public employment. And not public employment for the conventional purposes, fire, school teachers, and all that, but in these new and different ways, including ways that might compete with private enterprise. Venezuela is a very different situation than the United States in 1,000 ways. But putting that aside for a minute, it seems to me a crisis that occurred there produced already something very different from what these kinds of crises in the past have done, namely a Chavez character with the kind of intentions and base in the army and so forth, out of which he comes, and they give him some staying power, even faced with the hostility of the United States and all the rest of it. And these community organizations are remarkable, as are several other things he's done. But the big question for me is, and I think they seem to understand that there, can they make a transition from that which they have accomplished, which is impressive? Can they make a transition from that to a long-term institutionalized way of getting the mass of people structurally capable of running their own affairs and being the basis of a new kind of society? In a way, it happened the same way in Argentina. The workers, if you know the story there, that the capitalists abandoned the factories. They literally, the economy collapsed. And by the way, Naomi Klein has a film that she and her husband made called The Take. If you have an opportunity, it's showing around, and I'm sure it's on DVD. It is a pretty well-made film about what happened down there. Anyway, the capitalists in the downturn abandoned the factories, literally shut them, and threw the workers out. And the workers basically came back, took over the factories, sometimes after months had passed, and had to kind of scrape the dust off and oil them again and get them going and repair them. And then the idea was the workers didn't just sit in, start to Chicago, to demand money from the government. There were some who did that. But the thrust of the movement, that was the dynamic part, took a different step. This is not a short-term arrangement. We're taking over. And hence the struggle became, when it worked quite well in many different lines of work, the capitalists who had abandoned the factory wanted to come back, made claims that it's their property, etc., and they came back. And now the question was, and it's still being fought out under Mrs. Kirchner's government there, who's going to get this and how is this going to be resolved? But there I was struck by the positivity, by the potential of the fact, and I haven't seen this in Venezuela, I'm no expert on it, but I'm not aware of this yet in Venezuela, but in Argentina, perhaps because the breakdown there was so severe, what led to this, there was that next step when workers in trouble, without work, without support. The collapse in the Argentinian economy was staggering over those years, and it's not very long ago, that those workers took the next step, that somebody had it in their mind, and it became a national movement for the workers to take over and run these enterprises. And then there was the question, which is again the next one, how do workers organize an enterprise? Here's the saddest thing for me, given where I'm coming from, that some of the workers believed that to organize an enterprise, you ought to have a board of directors. And so they elected from their own number a board of directors, and then structured the enterprise, which then reproduced the very things that I'm arguing against. Because for workers to take over a factory is a major step. But it then opens the next door to another big decision. What do we do? How do we organize this? You know, in 1917, in the Soviet Revolution, workers took over lots of factories. But their idea of socialism was to take the factory over, throw out the old bosses, march on the Winter Palace, and go to Trotsky and Lenin and Stalin and the others and say, here, we made the revolution. Here, the state should take over. And then Monday morning, they went back and went to work. And the government sent in a group of people called the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers, who became the centralized board of directors. Not over and against the workers. It was the workers' own idea that production has to be organized in the conventional capitalist way. Instead of being responsible to shareholders, the board of directors responsible to the bureaucrats. But their own position wasn't changed. They were going to be workers. They weren't going to be workers who are also their own bosses. That's the difference. And that's a different project, which if we play our cards right and make the arguments and do the research and make the arguments about what that might mean, might very well become a focus for people's interest in a way that we don't have that many other things that might. Look at, it's always the same thing. Look at what's happening now. Factories shutting down, people losing their jobs, income is falling, unemployment is rising. We're facing a system that every day is in poor position to quarrel with a new way of going. Their way is in terrible shape. When the people in Argentina, when the workers took over, one of the first things they did, it's in the film a little bit, and you can read about it, is they began to reach out to other parts of the community for help. They needed engineers, they needed this, they needed that, and they asked, and people came. People came the way people are coming to that factory in Chicago to kind of help out. How many people will come, how much help they will give, we'll never know until we do this. But my guess is we will be pleasantly supplied. And we have the internet, the communication goes much faster, that's right. Really? Yeah, no, it's again, one of many kinds, when this thing goes, hundreds of movements like this to attack them in the court system, to, just a second. Oh, yes. In the court system, but also in important other ways. You know that many of you have heard about subprime mortgage debt, securities based on these mortgages that are failing. There's a whole other class of securities that were issued based on credit card debt. In other words, when you pay your credit card monthly bill to your bank, the bank is often just a collection agency. It takes that money and ships it to the people who bought the securities in which your debt is part of that. Just like your mortgage could be part of that. And that's very bad, very much down. They can't, one of the reasons credit card companies are tightening up, and I don't know if you've seen this, but the major credit card companies are predicting a cut on the order of $1 trillion over the next 6 to 12 months in the amount of credit they will allow credit card people to have. You're facing a new situation in which we will be getting, I expect, notices from our credit card companies that you're not used to, that your allowable maximum is reduced, that monthly minimum that you can pay to get along with that is going to go up, and so forth and so on, because they are unable to generate new money by selling the securities with the credit. So I think there are, in a number of ways, like the one you mentioned, avenues for people to begin to make these kinds of struggles that can be successful. A few years ago, the banks, seeing the problem of people being unable to pay their debts, the very story I told you earlier, we got the bankruptcy law changed a few years ago to make it much harder to declare bankruptcy. That was pushed through by the banks who had figured out the very story I'm telling you from a different angle, that people were having harder and harder time paying, and they were not going to get stuck, these banks, with bankruptcies which allow a person to escape from parts or all of their debt. So they changed the law. Well, I mean, here's a natural. Change it again. Change it back. Undo it. Obama already knows he has to undo a lot of the things Bush is doing right now, last minute things. Well, there's lots more to undo if there were a movement. This raises just a historical parallel too. It's important to remember that Franklin Roosevelt, who many people remember as some sort of pioneer of social welfare legislation, wasn't. He was elected on a balanced budget program. He was a very conservative president. He came into office doing all the things that conservatives do. It's because the Depression kept getting worse and worse and worse that he was forced to change from what he had been to what we now remember him for. And he was forced by mass upset, by marches on Washington, by unemployed people. But, and this is the sad part, a powerful trade union movement at that time, a powerful socialist party, and a powerful communist party in the United States, all of whom were working. Those were the years of organizing the CIO and the Communist Party and so on. And that together, all of that together, put a tremendous pressure amidst the deteriorating conditions. The best chance for Obama to do any of the things that the left people who supported him could hope for is, ironically, I suspect, dependent on continuing deterioration. Because we don't have a strong left, and we don't have a strong trade union movement. And consequently, they're not going to do it unless they're in turn energized by the combination of deteriorating conditions and a new vision and program. You know, here's the irony. I have liberal friends, and I tell them the most important thing for you to get, Mr. Krugman, whom I know, the most important thing for you, Mr. Krugman, is to have me be successful. Because if I can get somewhere, that'll scare the people you need to convince, and they'll listen to you because you're a lot less troublesome than me. So the irony is the left is needed to push, even to create the space for those much less left than we in the councils of power. Well, the part I talked about, the difference between wages and productivity, that works inside what's usually called the healthcare industry too, in terms of technology, both in the pharmaceutical part of it, and the hospital care part of it, and the medical care part of it. So I do think it's included in there. My own personal guess about where we're going to go is that if I'm right that the deterioration will continue and the unemployment and so forth, because the Obama folks are not able or willing to make the kinds of breakthroughs that could solve the problem, then I'm afraid that what might happen, and I suspect that something like this, is that you have a continuing inequality of income, inequality of suffering as this economy goes down in all the usual ways. But the alternative, the sop, if you like, the compensation for America will be a national health program. That this will be the one thing that is given, that everyone is supposed to focus on the left, celebrate, welcome, and so on, because it's the one area where you could put together the kind of consensus between the business community that wants to put the cost of healthcare off of its own shoulders onto the public, and the public that is desperate because of all the problems of paying for healthcare. There you could put together something which, if properly hyped, would drown out all the other areas of people's lives that are deteriorating, but that would be held up as the great achievement. I mean, there are some signs of something like that being worked out, and I would, myself, given everything I've said, this would be, if it worked, would undercut the very thrust of the kind of fundamental change in the organization of society. So I worry about that. If workers become their own board of directors, then they get into their hands the surplus, the difference between the productivity and the cost of producing. As it stands now, portions of that are taken for a variety of things by capitalists to fit into their notion of how the world ought to work, which includes, when they're forced to, paying pensions and things like that. There's nothing to prevent the workers who themselves would run the corporations from understanding exactly the same, the need for collective sums of money to be taken out of each pot of surplus, the way it is now, in order to sustain people who are dependent in one way or another, who are ill or who are aged or who are children and so on. You know, every society has done that one way or another. There's nothing to prevent collectives of workers from working out in their relationships with one another mechanisms to distribute the surpluses they themselves dispose of in socially appropriate ways. There'll be arguments and discussions and disputes about it, as there are always, but there's no intrinsic difficulty about it. And if you understand some of the logic I've said, if you're not busy, just to give you a simple example, groups of workers could not and would not have paid 20, 40, 60, $80 million a year pay packages for executives. They wouldn't have done that. Or at least it's highly unlikely. They wouldn't have done that. That's not the mentality of a group of workers. They probably even couldn't work out which of them are going to get it, since they can't all get it, so none of them would get it, which is probably how this would work. But it would free up huge amounts of money that now would be allocated by these workers to something else that they could agree on. You know, it's not that there aren't problems and disagreements. This is not paradise or anything like that. It's a change. I like to use the following metaphor in my classes, so bear with me. Some people think, when they compare the condition of being single with the condition of being married, that the one is awful and the other one is paradise. And then if you believe that, you're in for a lot of pain. And after a while, you wise up and you understand there's one kind of set of contradictions that goes with the one condition, and there's a different set of problems that goes with the other, and what we all do is choose between them, but we choose wisely. I prefer this set of problems than that set of problems. It's the same thing here. It's not the solution to everything. Collectivization in this way, this kind of a socialism, is not going to solve all problems. A different set of problems will happen, but the old one is breaking down, and this one offers a number of values and virtues and possibilities that we at least ought to explore and try and see. And that there's no reason not to have the courage to demand it, and if enough people did, it would begin to find its way. The old story I tell, and some of you have heard me one more time, every year for the last 30 years, hundreds of well-paid engineers in Silicon Valley quit their jobs with Cisco Systems and IBM and get together with a dozen of their friends with their laptops in somebody's garage. And they insist that everybody's equal there, no bosses, and they run their little businesses as collectives in exactly the same way I described. That's where I got the idea. Monday to Thursday we work on software, Friday we're our own board of directors. They vote with their feet. They quit their capitalist job and set up a completely different class structure of functioning in their enterprise. And they insist that their creativity as engineers and software people doubles. They insist that the great breakthroughs in computer technology have not been made by capitalist firms, but precisely by these little ones, and that's the argument for why this ought to be tried on a national scale, because it's already been tried de facto. It's just a shame that the left can't look at these models that exist, recognize them for what they are, and begin to use them as models and prototypes for what is wanted on a national scale. We do it when we see a group of workers take over a factory in Chicago. We do it then. We go, this should be everywhere, and rightly so. But we also have models of these other organizations that can also serve, if we only recognize and celebrate them, as models for something else that can grab an awful lot of people who might have difficulty relating to a Chicago example of workers thrown out of work, but might find it much easier to understand the model of those engineers.